The global landscape of death and devastation makes the label Cold War a cruel and parochial joke. The Cold War could have been a lot worse. In fact, the Cold War could have and almost did lead to the destruction of the world on numerous occasions. A deeper look inside the world of U.S. nuclear policy, for example, is a journey through a labyrinth of close calls, decision-making, and planning simply devoid of all conceivable logic, and facts that sound totally unbelievable until you find out that they're completely true. Beginning in June 1961, the official policy, if the U.S. launched a first strike, was to unleash its entire nuclear arsenal of 3,423 weapons, totaling over 7,000 megatons. Compared to the 14-kiloton weapon dropped on the city of Hiroshima, this barrage of bombs would be distributed not only to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but also China. This policy, known as the Single Integrated Operational Plan, was estimated to kill over 100 million Russians, let alone the rest of the targeted areas. Fred Kaplan, in his book Wizards of Armageddon, put the total fatality estimate at close to 300 million. But who's to say? Indeed, even before the rapid buildup of nuclear weapons in the 1980s, we had more than enough firepower to destroy the world.
The terror-induced anesthesia, which suspended rational thought, made nuclear war thinkable and grossly excessive arsenals possible during the Cold War.
That's General George Lee Butler, the last chief of the Strategic Air Command, or SAC. He would also lead SAC's successor, the U.S. Strategic Command. After leaving his post, Butler would become a foremost nuclear deproliferation activist, even calling for their complete abolition. In a 2015 interview, he spoke candidly about his responsibilities as SAC commander, which included writing the U.S. nuclear war plan. At its height, we had 36,000 weapons. Imagine that. 36,000. We had warheads on artillery shells that could be launched from jeeps. We had dozens of warhead types and delivery systems. Indeed, the portability of tactical nuclear weapons had become absurd. This footage, showing the 1962 Little Feller tests, declassified in 1997, shows the firing of a tripod-mounted recoilless rifle armed with a 70-pound W-54 warhead, the smallest nuke ever developed by the U.S. military. The launcher, nicknamed Davy Crockett, could also be mounted, as General Butler said, on a jeep and operated by as few as 2 men. It could launch the projectile just miles away and had the destructive power of around 20 tons of TNT, which also, of course, irradiated everything around the blast. Deterrence was an open-ended invitation to just build more and more complicated systems. We always found a reason to go to the next level of arms. Of course, this was true even before the Davy Crockett nuclear launcher. The year before, in 1961, the Soviets had outgunned the United States in the nuclear race by testing the largest weapon ever detonated, the Tsar Bomba, which was, and this sounds hard to believe, but it's actually true, 15 times the destructive power of every bomb dropped in all of World War II. Having dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan less than 6 years earlier, President Harry S. Truman authorized the transfer of 9 nuclear bombs to the Air Force to be deployed to the island of Okinawa. In April of 1951, General Douglas MacArthur had lobbied hard for their use and even considered creating a sea of irradiated cobalt along the North Korean border with China. Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had drafted plans for nuking China in the event of their intervention in Vietnam, a fact revealed by Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers. Eisenhower's Joint Chiefs of Staff again mulled over deploying nuclear weapons against China during the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958. Of course, Kennedy would see the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, during which a Soviet submarine armed a nuclear warhead-tipped torpedo for launch. Again in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland drafted the top-secret Fracture Jaw Plan, to transfer nuclear weapons to South Vietnam to be used against the North. On October 9, 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir ordered nuclear strike planes and missiles to go on alert. We escaped the Cold War without a nuclear holocaust by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, probably the latter in greatest proportion. Having gone through a massively incomplete review of the nuclear history and how close to Armageddon we came, one thing remains true. Though the Soviet Union and the United States did not engage in battle with each other, and though we never deployed nuclear weapons in battle, despite coming dangerously close to doing so, we were still able to achieve nuclear holocaust levels of destruction in numerous wars in the 20th century. But of course, not only wars caused untold suffering and mass death, but also, namely, political violence at large. Coups, revolutions, terrorism, massacres, assassinations, war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, the list goes on. As the most devastating war in the history of mankind was coming to a close, rather than a tranquil peace, the world erupted into another grueling period, particularly for Asia. It was 1947 when President Truman pledged U.S. support to Greece and Turkey, in a speech which historians would use to mark the Cold War's earnest beginning.
Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East.
That same year, the U.S. was funneling billions of dollars in cash and arms to the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek in China. The civil war between the nationalist KMT and communists led by Mao Zedong had reignited, culminating in a brutal campaign of political repression. Up to that point, nationalist troops had killed some 1 million people in a white terror on the mainland. But in 1947, the white terror was exported to the island of Formosa. Clearing a path ahead for their permanent relocation to the island 2 years later, the nationalist KMT would begin with a massacre of anti-government demonstrators in the notorious February 28th incident. The ensuing purge would exterminate some 20,000 people. After fellow communist Ho Chi Minh appealed to the United States to recognize an independent Vietnam, the U.S. chose instead to assist the French in reclaiming their old colony. After the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the U.S. would replace them altogether. At Geneva, they created the country of South Vietnam, a military dictatorship led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Though Diem was brutal, with his forces killing some 70,000 people between 1957 and 1961, his reign was but an infinitesimal drop in the bucket compared to his American overlords. In 1962, President Kennedy would, in his short stint as president, permanently alter the U.S. security policy of Latin America, which would have major implications for the future of the continent. Codified in this Joint Chiefs of Staff memorandum, so-called hemispheric defense was shifted to internal security. That same year, Kennedy would send Special Forces General William Yarborough to Colombia to secretly train Colombians in paramilitary, sabotage, and/or terrorist activities. It should be backed by the United States. An institutionalized culture of violence ensued in the Colombian military, and with the introduction of the 3398 Edict, in which weapons were furnished to civilians for national defense, the situation spiraled. For example, in the 1970s, there were over 1,000 political killings in Colombia. In the 1980s, there were over 12,000. In 2007, El Tiempo would publish a front-page story titled "Colombia Searches for 10,000 Bodies," referring to those massacred who had been thrown into mass graves and never found, though the figure could be high as 30,000. The paper interviewed an AUC militant who explained that to train recruits in execution and dismemberment, they would practice on live victims who they kept imprisoned. The instructions were to remove their arms, their heads, to dismember them alive. The violence would continue through the 1990s, and in 2000, the Colombian Commission of Jurists would conclude that 80% of the killings were perpetrated by the military and their paramilitaries. Even with the Second World War's end, the fighting didn't stop in Korea. The conflict between the Soviet-occupied North and the American South stoked international concern. The Americans had picked Syngman Rhee to lead the military government of South Korea, and he would consolidate his power by imprisoning his political opponents, only to murder them all. The government created a system to track suspected communists and place them in re-education programs. The program would swell to 300,000 people, most of them, of course, being not communists or even politically active, but those selected from the poorest ranks of society. In the so-called Summer of Terror of 1950, Rhee decided that the best thing to do would be to liquidate them all. An estimate of 100,000 summarily executed is, according to South Korean historian Kim Dong-chun, very conservative. He suggested a number that was double that. And while this white terror produced an astonishing number of killed, it was not even in the same universe as the ensuing saturation bombing of the entire Korean peninsula. Japan may have been firebombed and nuked, but over the course of the 3-year Korean War, the peninsula would be pummeled with 4 times the tonnage of bombs as was dropped on Japan, including the 2 atomic bombs, an amount roughly equivalent to all the explosives dropped in the entire Pacific theater. Indeed, despite never being nuked, Korea fared far worse than Japan, according to the U.S. Air Force's own estimates. I would say that almost the entire Korean peninsula is just a terrible mess. Everything is destroyed. There is nothing standing worthy of the name. Veteran World War II General Curtis LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command during the war, would admit, "We burned down just about every city in North and South Korea both. We killed off over 1 million civilian Koreans." In September of 1965, General William Westmoreland, commander of the entire military mission in Vietnam, issued MAC-V Directive No. 525-3. The directive, titled Combat Operations Minimizing Non-Combatant Battle Casualties, was the beginning of the so-called Free Strike Zone. Free strike zones should be configured to eliminate populated areas except those in accepted VC bases, VC as in Viet Cong. A month later, the directive was expanded on further. Except for accepted VC war zones and base areas, free strike zones are being reconfigured to eliminate populated areas. In free strike zones, in the words of infantryman Robert J. Graham, everyone, men, women, children, could be considered the enemy. You could not be held responsible for firing on innocent civilians since by definition there were none there. In 1964, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara produced figures on territory under Viet Cong control or predominant influence, and according to him, 22 of the 43 provinces of South Vietnam were open to unlimited aerial assault. But, as declassified State Department papers explained, the destruction of course didn't end there. Saturation bombing by artillery and airstrikes, for example, is an accepted tactic, and there is probably no province where this tactic has not been widely employed. The neighboring country of Laos would comprise its own free fire zone, where during the course of the war in Vietnam, the U.S. military would drop more bombs than were dropped on Japan and also Germany during all of World War II. Jet planes came daily and destroyed all stationary structures. Nothing was left standing. The villagers lived in trenches and holes or in caves. It wasn't until 2004 that the National Archives released a trove of transcripts of voice recordings known as the Kissinger tapes. Embedded in the pages was a phone call from 1969. Kissinger relays an order from President Nixon. A massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. Anything that flies on anything that moves. In 1953, the CIA was at work publishing a killing manual called A Study of Assassination. The manual would be handed over to the Guatemalan military. The manual provides a list of techniques, beginning with manual. A hammer, axe, wrench, screwdriver, fire poker, kitchen knife, lampstand, or anything hard, heavy, and handy will suffice. Followed by accidents. The most efficient accident is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. Then drugs. If the subject drinks heavily, morphine can be injected at the passing out stage. The cause of death will often be held to be acute alcoholism. There's also edge weapons or knives and axes. Absolute reliability is obtained by severing the spinal cord in the cervical region. In 1954, President Eisenhower, who had just a year earlier removed Mohammad Mossadegh from power in Iran, would go 2 for 2. With the help of his underlings, the Dulles brothers, Jacobo Arbenz would meet the same fate. The military junta that took charge afterward used what they had learned in their manuals to liquidate dissenters. Guatemala was unique among the many other Latin American coups that the U.S. engineered, since the military dictatorship didn't really seem to know when to quit. Already by 1976, 20,000 would be exterminated by the military, not a small number, but in 1978 the killing fields became awash with corpses. You see, in Guatemala, the peasant class was largely made up of the indigenous Maya. The Maya, by virtue of their poverty, were deemed to be communists, and so the government massacred them wherever they found them. In what's been referred to as the Maya Holocaust, by 1983, the government had exterminated as many as 200,000 people, the vast majority of them Maya. Indeed, between 1948 and 1990, according to Latin American expert John Henry Coatsworth, the U.S. overthrew 24 Latin American countries. A particularly ambitious initiative embarked on by the dynamic Nixon-Kissinger duo was none other than Operation Condor. The stage was set by a series of coups in the southern cone, namely Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay. All of these countries would be overthrown by their militaries. With the help of the CIA, the intelligence agencies of these countries would be connected. The intelligence sharing network formed by Operation Condor allowed for surveillance, tracking, arrest, detention, and assassination of targets in all of the countries affected. Beginning with the 1976 coup which placed Jorge Rafael Videla into power, the ensuing political repression would become perhaps South America's most notorious, immortalized as the Dirty War. The junta would institutionalize disappearances, where those arrested and then executed by the military were made to vanish, hiding their corpses in, namely, the Rio de la Plata, and also in mass graves. The number of disappeared in Argentina alone is estimated to be as high as 30,000. In all, Operation Condor is said to have claimed the lives of 60,000. After a coup wrested power from the post-colonial leader Sukarno, the Indonesian military under General Suharto would lead the country into the 1990s. As Kathy Kadane reports in 1990, the U.S. State Department and CIA officials furnished the Indonesian army with lists of thousands of names of suspected communists. As many as 5,000 names were furnished over a period of months to the army there, and the Americans later checked off the names of those who had been killed or captured. It really was a big help to the army. They probably killed a lot of people, and I probably have a lot of blood on my hands, but that's not all bad. There's a time when you have to strike hard at a decisive moment. According to a research study conducted by the CIA and declassified in 2007, in terms of the numbers killed, the anti-PKI massacres in Indonesia rank as one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century. The Indonesian coup is certainly one of the most significant events of the 20th century, far more significant than many other events that have received much greater publicity. Estimates vary, but it's widely held that up to 1 million people were killed in the purge. But Suharto wasn't finished. In December 1975, Suharto began Operasi Seroja, or Operation Lotus, invading the tiny nation of East Timor. Fretilin, the left-wing party in power at the time, declared war. In response, the Indonesians probably killed 200,000 people. Beginning under Gerald Ford and continuing under Jimmy Carter, the humanitarian, the United States provided steady support. Indeed, as the campaign waged on, Carter's national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski called for expanding assistance to Indonesia and also for easing up on those pesky human rights pressures. During the Reagan years, military aid to El Salvador increased precipitously to $6 billion from 1981 to 1989, swelling the number of security forces from 12,000 to 53,000. On December 11, 1981, the military conducted the largest massacre in modern Latin American history at the village of El Mozote, where between 800 to 1,000 people were slaughtered. The soldiers did not think to spare any children. If we don't kill them now, they'll just grow up to be guerrillas. The White Terror in El Salvador targeted the usual suspects, mainly peasants in the countryside. Death squads, being ubiquitous in Latin America at the time, went to work in El Salvador as well, exterminating their fellow citizens, until roughly 75,000 were executed and disappeared. In 1984, a CIA war manual was leaked to the public, written specifically for the Contras. The manual contained instructions on how to assassinate judges and police officers, and even suggested targeting civilians. Explained that if that citizen had managed to escape, he would have alerted the enemy. In order to destabilize the economy, the Contras destroyed farms, health clinics, schools, and targeted teachers, nurses, even coffee pickers were liquidated. In December 1984, Contras attacked a truck carrying volunteer coffee pickers near Telpaneca, firing into the truck. A few nevertheless remained alive, at least for a while. Next, they lit the truck on fire with gasoline. By the end of that war in 1989, the conflict and economic embargo had taken the lives of over 30,000 people, and rendered Nicaragua the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The eminent statesman Zbigniew Brzezinski, who we know for his affection for the Indonesian government, devised a clever plan for attacking the Soviets in order to destabilize the USSR. The plan? Support radical Islamic extremism. In 1979, Brzezinski persuaded Carter to launch Operation Cyclone, and by the late 1980s, funding reached $500 million a year. Its goal was to mobilize Muslim militants to attack Soviet interests deep into the heartland in Central Asia, especially in Afghanistan. By funding the Afghan Mujahideen, it had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter essentially, "We now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War." Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally, the breakup of the Soviet Empire. I need your help. This channel relies on donations and patrons. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to support me and what I do, please consider becoming a patron. There are exclusive videos there. I accept donations through PayPal, Cash App. I also accept cryptocurrency. I accept Bitcoin and Ethereum donations. So please, if you want to support me, become a patron, give a donation. Those are ways that you can support me. And of course, most importantly of all, please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you so much. Take care. I love you so much.